So this is just gonna be a little brief overview of roses and glimpse of what they are and things like that. So roses are flowering plants. There's species roses or wild roses that you would find out in nature. People also grow them in their yards. These can either stay small, medium, big. Oftentimes you'll find large groups of wild roses that are spread by suckers, which are usually the underground roots have spread out and then sent up stems from them further away from the plants. Um, then there's two major classes of roses: old garden roses and modern garden roses. A brief definition that I use, at least, and that is used often by the American Rose Society, is um, any rose. An old garden rose is any rose that belongs to a class of roses that was in existence prior to 1867. A modern garden rose would be any rose that was in the class in existence after 1867. I do have a couple of videos which talk more in depth about old garden roses and modern garden roses, and I will link in the description below to those. Um, a brief breakdown of old garden roses. Predominantly, you'll find a lot of once blooming roses, usually in the spring, um, that have a tendency to be more cold hardy than the repeat blooming roses. The old garden roses also have the China and tea roses, which do repeat bloom. Modern garden usually have more repeat blooming, so they'll bloom spring, summer, and fall more often than old garden roses will. But there is that overlap of the China's teas, noisettes that are old garden roses. There is another group of roses called climbers. Also, ramblers are in that same general classification. Rambler has longer, thinner canes usually than climber does. Climbers often will also have more repeat blooming roses than ramblers will. To be fair, both ramblers and climbers don't technically, by the botanical classification, climb. They use their prickles, which we also call thorns, to hook onto something and lift themselves up above something. But in the botanical or definition, a climber is something that has an instrument that will actually cling to, trundle around, such as grapes, cling to, such as ivy, and pull itself that way. Roses will not. Doesn't actually have something that will physically pull themselves up. They're kind of more leaners than climbers by that definition. Modern garden roses consist of hybrid teas, English roses, shrub roses, miniature roses. Like I said earlier, there is a more in-depth video that I'll put a description in, or a link in the description below. You can get roses multiple ways. One is going to your local nursery big box store and buy them there. You can also go online and order roses from rose nurseries online. There are two general ways of getting roses, either at your local box store or online. One way is bare root, where the plant's been dug up, the soil has been removed from the roots, and they get shipped that route. The other way is potted, meaning it's usually actively growing. Occasionally, you'll find nurseries take their bare roots and they will pod them up right as spring is kicking into gear, so they'll maybe breaking dormancy at that point. Potted roses are active growing. There's two ways of propagating plants asexually: grafting them, and then, which takes a little piece of the plant to bud, and putting onto the roots of another and growing the desired plant. Also, you can take a cutting of the plant and root it out. That's called an own root rose. A lot of mail order rose nurseries do own root roses. Also, with the grafted rose,
when the bud is, you'll have canes coming out of that. It's called the bud union. And there's a debate on whether or how deep you should plant that. Some places say plant it up to 2 inches above the soil line. There are places that say put the bud union 2 to 4 inches below the soil line. I've heard justification, I guess not argument, of putting it below the soil no matter where you are is that it adds stability to the plant, which makes sense. I would say if nothing else, plant it at least right on top of the soil or in halfway through the soil line. But probably the deeper, or not the deeper, but probably burying it under the ground is probably better. But I'm gonna let someone else decide what they think about that. There's multiple ways to prune them depending on what you want. Generally, keep in mind the first thing to go dead and diseased plant are canes, and then prune out canes that are crossing. Depending on how big you want the bush to be, prune for size. I would just keep in mind that not every rose bush gets pruned like hybrid tea or floribunda. Shrub roses get pruned differently. Old garden roses get pruned differently. If it's a once blooming rose, if you're going to prune it right after it flowers. That way you're not cutting off the rest of the flowering for the next year. I think that about covers it for this video. Thank you for your time and have a good day.